The first thing you should know about success is that it doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It builds quietly, like a glacier, until one day the landscape is unrecognizable. My name is Eleanor Chen, and for 7 years, I allowed myself to be a footnote in someone else's story. Today, I conduct my own symphony. Professor James Harrington didn't look up from his desk when I entered his office that spring afternoon. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair, creating a halo effect that seemed appropriate for someone so revered in the architectural world. The walls of his office were adorned with awards and photographs built that stretched toward the sky like prayers, each one bearing his signature minimalist style. Eleanor. He spoke my name like an afterthought, still not meeting my eyes. Have a seat. I clutched my portfolio tighter against my chest, the culmination of my graduate thesis work, suddenly feeling inadequate in his presence. For 2 years, I had worshipped at the altar of his genius, absorbing every lecture, every critique, molding my own vision to better align with his. I've been reviewing your thesis proposal, he said, finally looking up. His eyes were the pale blue of winter mornings, analytical and cold. Your concept for sustainable urban housing, utilizing mycelium-based materials, is interesting. Interesting. The word hung in the air between us. Not innovative, not groundbreaking, just interesting. A placeholder word used when you have nothing substantial to say. Thank you, Professor. I've been researching the application of biomimicry in... Yes, I read all that. He waved a hand dismissively. The issue, Eleanor, is that while it's conceptually intriguing, it lacks practicality. The architectural field requires more than just idealistic visions. It demands execution. My throat tightened. I've included preliminary structural analysis and material testing results in Appendix C, which demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of load-bearing capabilities in residential structures. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. This is precisely why I'm concerned about recommending you for the Nakamura Fellowship. The Nakamura Fellowship. The words hit me like physical blows. The most prestigious postgraduate opportunity in our field, a year working alongside master architects in Kyoto, designing structures that honored tradition while embracing innovation. It had been my dream since the first day of graduate school, my voice embarrassingly small. My academic record is excellent, yes. He nodded, almost sympathetically. Your theoretical work is sound. But architecture isn't built on theories, Eleanor. It's built on stone and steel and glass. On certainty. He stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the campus. I've decided to recommend Daniel for the fellowship instead. Daniel, my classmate, whose work mimicked Harrington's style so perfectly, it bordered on plagiarism. Daniel, who had once told me during a late-night study session that women architects always try to make buildings too nurturing, as if it were objective criticism rather than casual sexism. His vision aligns more closely with what the Nakamura Committee is looking for, Harrington continued. He understands that architecture isn't about saving the world, it's about reshaping it. I sat motionless, the portfolio on my lap, suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. Inside it were my dreams, rendered in exquisite detail, living buildings that could heal urban environments, structures that worked with nature rather than against it. 2 years of research, of sleepless nights, of believing my vision mattered. I see, I managed to say, though I didn't see it all. Harrington returned to his desk and sat down, already reaching for another student's work. You have talent, Eleanor. But this, he gestured, vaguely toward my portfolio. This isn't where architecture is headed. I suggest you consider commercial design. Your attention to aesthetic detail would serve you well there. Commercial design? Shopping malls and office buildings. Safe spaces where innovation wasn't required or rewarded. Thank you for your time, Professor, I said, rising from my chair on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The dismissal was clear not just from his office, but from the future I had mapped out for myself, of course. He was already absorbed in other papers, my career assessment completed in less than 15 minutes. Close the door on your way out. I did close the door. I closed it on my ambitions, on my trust in mentorship, on my belief that excellence alone would open doors. As I walked across campus that day, The spring flowers seemed to mock me with their effortless beauty, their natural purpose. I had lost my purpose in the span of a single conversation. That night, I packed away my thesis materials, my sketches, my dreams of biomimetic architecture. I graduated 3 months later, accepted a position at a mid-sized commercial firm in Chicago, and became exactly what Harrington predicted I would be: competent, unremarkable, safe. The first year passed in a blur of bathroom layouts and office tower lobbies. I designed spaces that would be forgotten the moment they were exited. My name appeared in small font on project credits, sometimes misspelled, always overlooked. I watched my salary deposit into my bank account every 2 weeks and told myself it was enough. It wasn't the work that haunted me, it was the silence. The silence of my own voice, no longer advocating for what I believed architecture could be. The silence of surrender. Some nights I would wake at 3 a.m., my fingers itching to sketch something that breathed, something that lived beyond its blueprint. Daniel's fellowship in Kyoto yielded exactly the results Harrington had predicted. A profile in Architectural Digest, a minor award for a meditation pavilion that borrowed heavily from Japanese tradition without understanding its soul. Upon his return, he was hired by Harrington's own firm, their aesthetic sensibilities perfectly aligned. Meanwhile, I designed another food court, another office lobby, another space that would never challenge anyone's perception of what architecture could be. Until the morning I spilled coffee on my desk and, while cleaning up, knocked over a potted succulent. As I gathered the spilled soil, something caught my larger network of white filaments threading through the dark earth. Mycelium, the living root system of fungi, building invisible networks underground. I stared at those delicate white threads for a long time, remembering my thesis, remembering my vision. Then I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I sketched. Not a bathroom layout or a lobby design, but a building concept. A structure that could grow, adapt, clean the air around it. A building that was more ecosystem than edifice. That night, I started researching again. Not for a client, not for a firm, but for myself. I discovered that in the year I'd been designing forgettable spaces, mycelium-based building materials had advanced significantly. A small lab in Seattle was now producing mycelium bricks with remarkably high compressive strength. A Dutch firm had created self-healing concrete infused with fungal spores. My vision hadn't been impractical, it had been early. I began spending my evenings and weekends developing what I had abandoned. I converted my spare bedroom into a makeshift laboratory, growing mycelium samples, testing their properties, documenting everything. I connected with researchers online, sharing ideas, building a community that Harrington would have dismissed as hobbyists. 6 months into this double life, I received an email from Hiroshi Tanaka, an environmental engineer in Tokyo who had been following my research posts. He was assembling a team for a competition, Global Sustainable Architecture. Challenge and believed my work with biomimetic materials could be the cornerstone of their entry. Your approach is not just innovative, his email read, it is necessary. Architecture must evolve beyond aesthetics to become a healing force. Will you join us? I read his email 7 times, then called my boss and requested a 3-month leave of absence. When he denied it, I submitted my resignation. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Tokyo, my research carefully packed alongside clothes for a stay of indefinite length. 3. The Tokyo team welcomed my ideas with an enthusiasm I had forgotten could exist in architectural circles. Hiroshi introduced me to Mei Lin, a structural engineer whose calculations proved that my mycelium-reinforced bamboo could indeed support the weight I had theorized. Kenji Yamamoto, a biologist, helped refine the growth medium to ensure the living elements of our building would thrive in urban environments. We worked 18-hour days, sleeping on cots in the studio, eating meals brought by Hiroshi's mother, who clucked disapprovingly at our thinness but beamed with pride at her son's work. For the first time since that day in Harrington's office, I felt my voice returning tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Our design evolved into something I could never have created alone. A community center for a tsunami-devastated coastal town. The structure would be partially grown rather than merely built, with a mycelium foundation that could strengthen over time and adapt to the shifting coastline. The walls would filter toxins from the air, and the entire building would eventually decompose back into the earth when its life cycle ended, leaving no waste. When we submitted our entry to the Global Sustainable Architecture Challenge, I added my name with a steady hand. Eleanor Chen, not a footnote, not an afterthought, a creator. 3 months later, we learned our design had made the finalist round. We would be presenting in person at the International Architecture Biennial in Venice. They're flying in judges from around the world, Hiroshi told me, his eyes bright with excitement. The most influential names in sustainable design will be there. I scanned the list of judges he handed me, my eyes catching on one name near the bottom. James Harrington, Dryden Chair of Architectural Innovation, representing North America. My stomach dropped. After 2 years, I would face him agonat as his student, but as a finalist in a competition that could redefine sustainable architecture. Part of me wanted to withdraw, to avoid his dismissive gaze, his certainty that my vision was flawed. "Is something wrong?" Hiroshi asked, noticing my expression. I could have explained, could have shared how this man had nearly extinguished my passion. Instead, I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. "Nothing's wrong," I said. "Let's get back to work." In the weeks before Venice, I refined our presentation obsessively. Every detail, every projected outcome, every material specification had to be perfect. Not to impress Harrington, the thought did cross my mind, but because the work deserved that level of respect. Our design wasn't just a building, it was a manifesto, a declaration that architecture could heal rather than consume. The night before our presentation, walking along Venice's moonlit canals, I realized something fundamental had shifted within me. I no longer needed Harrington's approval. His voice, which had echoed in my head for years, had been replaced by my own, by Hiroshi's, by May's and Kenji's, by all those who saw possibility where others saw impracticality. The presentation hall in Venice was filled with architects, journalists, students all buzzing with anticipation for the 5 finalist teams. Our team would present last, giving us the advantage of closing the session, but the disadvantage of following 4 brilliant presentations. I spotted Harrington immediately, sitting in the front row with the other judges, his silver hair still forming that academic halo. He was leaning toward a younger judge, whispering something that made them both smile. I wondered if he would recognize Meth's unremarkable student he had redirected toward commercial design. When our turn came, Hiroshi began with the context tsunami-ravaged town. The need for structures that could withstand future natural disasters while helping heal the environmental damage. May followed with the structural innovations, her diagrams showing how our living building would actually strengthen over time rather than degrade. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the center of the stage, acutely aware of Harrington's eyes on me, and began to explain the biomimetic heart of our design. My voice, to my surprise, was clear and confident. Architecture has traditionally seen buildings as static and frozen music, as Goethe famously described them, I said. But what if our buildings could be more like symphonies that evolve over time? What if they could respond to their environment, heal damage, clean the air they occupy? I advanced to the next slide, showing the mycelium network that would form the building's foundation and self-healing system. Nature doesn't build with dead materials. It grows, it adapts, it heals. Our design brings these principles into architecture, using mycelium fungal networks that can be both structural elements and living systems. As I spoke, I noticed Harrington's expression change from polite interest to focused attention. He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. I continued, explaining how our building would sequester carbon, filter toxins, and eventually return to the earth without waste. This isn't conceptual, I emphasized, addressing the very criticism he had once leveled at me. We've built and tested prototypes at various scales. The structural calculations account for seismic activity, wind loads, and the gradual strengthening of the mycelium network over time. I concluded my portion and handed off to Kenji for the biological specifics. As I stepped back, I caught Harrington's eye for the first time. There was no recognition, there just the evaluative gaze of a judge considering a submission. After our presentation, during the judge's deliberation, I stepped outside for air. The Venetian evening was warm, the sky deepening to indigo above the ancient city. I leaned against a stone balustrade, watching gondolas glide silently along the canal below. It was you, wasn't it, Eleanor Chen? I turned to find Harrington standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Yes, I said simply. No explanation, no reminder of our last meeting. Let him work for this conversation. Your mycelium concept, he said, moving to stand beside me at the balustrade. You presented something similar as a thesis proposal. The core idea, yes. He nodded slowly. It's evolved considerably. The structural integration with traditional materials is particularly innovative. I said nothing, waiting. The silence stretched between us until he broke it again. I may have been hasty in my assessment of your work back then. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as James Harrington likely came to one. I could have pointed out how his dismissal had nearly derailed my career, how his narrow vision of architecture had failed to see the very future our industry was now embracing. I could have asked about Daniel, whose star had risen so quickly under Harrington's mentorship, only to fade when his work proved derivative. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you for your consideration of our current project, Professor Harrington. The team has worked very hard on it." He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time. "You know I can't discuss the judge's deliberations, but I will say this. Your work challenges many of my assumptions about sustainable architecture. That's rare at this stage of my career." I nodded, accepting this as the closest thing to validation I would receive. "If you'll excuse me, I should rejoin my team." As I walked away, he called after me, "Eleanor, commercial work. I never saw any of it published." I paused, then turned back with a small smile. "That's because I never did any. Our project won the Global Sustainable Architecture Challenge. The announcement came with funding to build a prototype of our design in the coastal town and a 2-year research grant to further develop the technology. The photographs from the award ceremony show our team beaming, holding the crystal sculpture that represented our achievement. In the background of one image, partially blurred, stands Harrington, his expression thoughtful as he watches us celebrate. The victory changed everything and nothing. We returned to Tokyo and continued our work, now with resources and attention we hadn't had before. Inquiries came from universities, from firms, from governments interested in resilient architecture for vulnerable coastal areas. My inbox filled with speaking invitations, collaboration proposals, job offers. One email came from Daniel, Harrington's former protege, now teaching at an East Coast university. "I saw your winning design," he wrote. "It's fascinating work. Perhaps there's potential for collaboration between our institutions." I read his message 3 times, noting the careful neutrality of his tone, the way he positioned himself as a peer, rather than the rising star who had once taken the fellowship I coveted. I saved his email to a folder labeled Potential Collaborations and promised myself I would respond when I could do so with genuine professional interest, rather than lingering resentment. 6 months after Venice, I received another email that gave me pause. It was from the Dean of Architecture at my former university, inviting me to deliver the annual Innovation Lecturer Honor, typically reserved for architects with decades of recognition behind them. "Your groundbreaking work in biomimetic architecture represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking we strive to instill in our students," the dean wrote. "Professor Harrington specifically recommended you for this year's lecture." I sat with that information for a long time, turning it over like a strange object found on the shore. Harrington had recommended meth student whose vision he had once dismissed as impractical. Now he was positioning himself as the mentor who had recognized my potential. It would have been easy to decline, to deny him the narrative of having supported my success. But something in me had changed during those years of silence and transformation. I no longer needed to prove myself to him or anyone else. My work spoke for itself, in a voice so clear and compelling that even those who had once dismissed it were now listening. I accepted the invitation. When I returned to campus that fall, the architecture building seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than in my memory. Students hurried across the quad, clutching portfolios similar to the one I had once brought to Harrington's office. How many of them carried visions that would be deemed too ambitious, too idealistic? How many would silence their own voices to accommodate the limitations others placed on them? My lecture hall was filled beyond capacity, with students sitting in the aisles and standing along the walls. In the front row sat the faculty, Harrington among them, his silver hair now fully white, but still forming that academic halo. I began not with my success, but with my silence, years spent rebuilding my confidence after having my vision dismissed. I spoke about the mycelium in the spilled pot of soil that had reminded me of my purpose. I talked about finding collaborators who expanded my ideas rather than constraining them. Architecture isn't created in isolation, I told them. It grows from conversation, from challenge, from the constant push and pull between vision and practicality. Sometimes the voices that challenge us most harshly are the ones that ultimately strengthen our resolve. Throughout my lecture, I never once looked directly at Harrington. This wasn't about him. It was about the students watching me with hungry eyes, about the future of a field that needed their unique perspectives. When I opened the floor for questions, a young woman in the back row raised her hand. Did you ever doubt your vision when others couldn't see its value? I smiled, thinking of those silent nights in Chicago, of the mycelium threads in the spilled soil. Doubt is part of creation, I said. The question isn't whether you'll doubt yours or fits, whether you'll allow that doubt to silence you or motivate you to prove your vision's worth. After the lecture, there was a reception in the atrium. Students clustered around me, asking questions, sharing their own unconventional ideas. I gave each of them my full attention, remembering how it felt to have your vision truly seen. Eventually, Harrington approached, waiting patiently at the edge of the group until the students dispersed. That was quite a lecture, he said, offering me a glass of champagne. I accepted it with a nod. Thank you. You've come a long way from that thesis proposal in my office. The distance was necessary, I said simply. He studied me for a moment, then asked, do you resent me for it? For not seeing the potential? It was the question I had imagined answering 100 different ways over the years. Now that it hung in the air between us, I found the truth was simpler than any rehearsed response. No, I said. I needed to find my own way, my own voice. If you had approved my thesis, if I had won that fellowship, I might have built my career trying to please mentors, rather than following my own vision. He nodded slowly, something like respect settling in his expression. Well, for what it's worth, I'm pleased to have been proven wrong. I raised my glass slightly. To being proven wrong, then. It's how we all grow. Later that night, I walked alone across the campus, retracing the path I had taken after that devastating meeting in Harrington's office. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the quad. I stopped at the spot where I had once stood heartbroken, questioning every choice that had led me to architecture. A group of students passed by, laughing among themselves, portfolios clutched under their arms. They moved through moonlight and shadow, unaware of me watching them. Unaware that they walked through a moment that would echo through their own futures in ways they couldn't yet imagine. I smiled as they disappeared into the night, then continued my walk. Tomorrow, I would fly back to Tokyo, back to Hiroshi and Mei and Kenji, back to our growing studio where we were reimagining what architecture could be, back to the symphony I had created from silence. But tonight, I allowed myself this circle of completion, Rita, not in defeat, but in quiet triumph, not to confront, but to convert. The revenge, if it could be called that, wasn't in Harrington's acknowledgement of his misjudgment. It was in the fact that I no longer needed it.